All right, it looks like it's time to get started. We've got several people who've joined the webinar now, so I'd like to welcome everyone to the Heart of Illinois Water Pollution Control Operators meeting. I'm Nate Davis. I'll be giving a presentation today on biological nutrient removal. A couple quick items here before we get started. We are using Zoom webinar for today's presentation. There are a couple features here I'd like to highlight on how you can switch your video and the audio as far as going between slides and video. It's just done with these two icons here displayed up in the corner. We will have everybody's microphones and videos disabled while we're in webinar mode today. However, feel free to submit questions. We've got a Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen as shown here. You just simply click that and type in your question, and then we're going to allow time at the end of today's presentation to go through and answer all of those. Some other housekeeping items. We are recording today's webinar, and we will be making it available to everyone afterwards. We've also submitted today's webinar to Illinois EPA for CEU credits, but they have not gotten back to us yet with a course number. So we will be following up with everybody by email afterwards as soon as we do get that information from them, so you can get your CEUs. And we'll also use email to follow up with the links to the webinar. I guess a quick overview of what I'll be discussing today. First, going to briefly touch on some of the regulatory things that are occurring that can result in phosphorus or nutrient limits at plants. Then going to cover the basics of total nitrogen removal, and then switch to total phosphorus and actually spend the most amount of time on total phosphorus or combined total phosphorus, total nitrogen processes. And then finally wrap up with some operational considerations of these types of facilities. So where we're at as far as regulating nutrients in Illinois, to date, mostly everything's been based around phosphorus. We have a performance-based effluent standard where EPA will give any plant that's doing an expansion greater than 1 MGD, they're going to get a 1 milligram per liter total phosphorus limit, and that's on a monthly basis. We also have a total phosphorus water quality standard for lakes. We do not have a standard for streams at this time. There is a narrative type water quality standard that just describes offensive conditions. It says our streams need to be free of excess algae or sludge due to nutrients. And there have been instances where the state has given plants permit limits, or they've done a TMDL that can result in permit limits due to violations of either the lakes criteria or the narrative water quality criteria. We've also had on the total nitrogen side, I don't know of anybody that's got a limit for total nitrogen, but there were some lawsuits relating to anti-degradation and for plant expansions. So now for most plant expansions, again, for plants that are larger than 1 MGD, Illinois EPA will put in a permit requirement encouraging total phosphorus removal. They don't give you a permit limit, but what they do is ask you to report on efforts to remove total nitrogen and anything you're doing to try and improve that. And it's also worth mentioning that we do have a history of water quality work groups, particularly in Northern Illinois. These groups have gotten together to try and come up with water quality, watershed-based plans to be used instead of a TMDL, and trying to find the most cost-effective means of addressing nutrients without really stringent limits. So things started to kind of change rapidly around 2015. The state of Illinois released their state reduction loss strategy for nutrients, and this was a something that US EPA required them to do. Some outcomes of that was, they formed a science advisory committee. You can see bullet number 4 here. And this committee was charged with looking at the available data in Illinois and trying to come up with recommendations for nutrient-based water quality standards for all our streams in the state. Kind of concurrently to that, Chicago was involved in a lawsuit over phosphorus discharges from their plants, and they settled that in 2017. And their settlement with the NGOs included some permit language about a 0.5 milligram per liter phosphorus limit on an annual geometric mean by the year 2030. And it had some water shed-based items in it. And that really got the ball rolling for some discussions between Illinois EPA, the Illinois Association of Wastewater Agencies, and the same NGO groups about how to avoid lawsuits relating to the rest of the permits in Illinois. Because if you remember at that time, Illinois EPA had quite a backlog of permits for major dischargers, and it's largely because of NGOs threatening to sue over phosphorus. So what they came up with was really adopting a lot of the same language from the Chicago settlement. So as these major dischargers start getting new permits, they're getting requirements requiring a feasibility study on removing phosphorus, and they've got to study several different effluent limit scenarios. And that the idea is there, this allows EPA to collect information on the cost of compliance, but it also gets everybody planning for different types of effluent limits that we could be faced. They also want everybody to do an optimization report to show, that they're doing everything possible to optimize phosphorus removal at your existing plant, and to do any source control of it coming into the plant. And then they did include language on the permit limits for phosphorus in the future. So they wanted to write this to encourage biological phosphorus removal, but still give the option for a plant to elect to do sole chemical removal if they wanted. So if you want to do chemical removal, you're going to get a permit limit by 2025, and you're going to have to meet both a 1 milligram per liter monthly average and a 0.5 milligram per liter annual geometric mean. If you elect to do it biologically, then you get out to 2030 before they give you a permit limit. And in that case, they're just going to give you the 0.5 annual geometric mean. And they do have some other provisions in there. If you can prove your influence not suitable for phosphorus removal, you can get a less stringent permit limit, and you can also get an additional 5 years if you can show economic hardship for implementing the improvements. Another thing they've included in this permit special condition is some language about a nutrient assessment reduction plan. And this is really up to EPA. Whenever permits become due now, Illinois EPA for major discharges is now performing a risk of assessment for eutrophication. And they've got some criteria based, on the chlorophyll in the stream, chlorophyll A. You could, if they see any issues with DO swings or issues with both high DO, oversaturation, and pH, they can basically say you're at risk of eutrophication and that you need to do a NARP. The other thing that could trigger a NARP is if you're discharging to a stream that's already, has a known violation of like the narrative standard or something. And what this plan requires is you to, form or join a water quality watershed group that's going to study the stream and develop, stream specific standards for total nitrogen and total phosphorus, and then plans for complying with these. And really, the idea behind this is this is supposed to be, we're only doing this on stream segments where EPA is determined there's a problem, rather than doing it statewide and having some really ridiculous low phosphorus limits. And as you can see here on the next slide, that Nutrient Science Advisory Committee came out with a report in 2018, and they actually recommended extremely low phosphorus limits. So, it'd be about 0.1. It varied depending on where you're at in the state, but it's really all the limits were around 0.1 milligrams per liter for total phosphorus. And then they did recommend total nitrogen standards for streams that they considered weightable. They didn't get really into detail on how they defined weightable, but it'd be close to 4 milligrams per liter for the northern part of the state, and just around 1 for the southern part of the state. And there's a lot of gray area in here. This map I shown is actually the closest thing they have to a map in there of what they were defining as north and south. And as you can see, there's no real clear-cut boundary here. But I think Illinois EPA and definitely permit holders, everybody can agree that we do not want to have to implement these really low standards if we can come up with a better means of doing this. So getting into the basics of biological nutrient removal, first we'll talk about nitrogen. And there's concepts here that I'm sure everybody's really familiar with already. There's two main methods that total nitrogen is removed from your plant, and the first is just the amount of nitrogen uptake that's absorbed by the biomass as it's grown, and then wasted from your plant. So in general, the dry solids, the volatile dry solids of your waste activated sludge, roughly contains 12% total nitrogen by the theoretical stoichiometric relationship. So that's uptake into the cell mass, and then it's removed from the system when you waste sludge. The other means of removing total nitrogen is to first nitrify your ammonia nitrogen to a nitrate. And then we can use heterotropes to then, with addition of, if there's carbon present, to then convert that to nitrogen gas, and it gets off-gassed and released away where we don't have to worry about it anymore. So the thing about this is there's benefits to denitrification besides just meeting a permit limit. As we're removing ammonia, we need to use up 4.6 pounds of oxygen for every pound of ammonia that we're going to nitrify. But then when we convert it, or when we denitrify, the heterotrophs can use those nitrates as a oxygen source, and it's actually effectively getting like 2.8 pounds of oxygen per every pound that's denitrified back. And you're also gaining alkalinity as you're denitrifying. So there are some advantages there to, if you've got the ability to denitrify, it can save you electricity and improve your alkalinity. And then here's just an illustration of one of the most basic total nitrogen removal plants. The thing about the denitrification is you do need ample carbon to make that happen. So, your nitrates exist at the end of your anaerobic zone, but that's also where you have the least amount of carbon. So in the MLE process, what we do is put an anoxic zone ahead of the aerobic zone, and we actually bring the nitrates back into that anoxic zone to be denitrified by means of a recycle pump. And here's kind of an illustration. The one downside of a recycle pump is, you're never fully going to capture all the nitrogen that you want to denitrify. And so as you increase the amount of flow that you're bringing back with that recycle pipe, to a degree, you do remove more and more total nitrogen, but you start seeing less and less benefit. And, the generally accepted knee of the curve on this is about 4 times your influent flow rate gives you the most bang for your buck on energy used to denitrify. It also, I guess, in the event of low flows, you also want to keep an eye on these recycles, just to make sure that you're not bringing back too much. As if you start bringing back too high of a ratio, you can risk bringing back high DO from that aerobic zone back to your anoxic zone, and effectively you won't have an anoxic zone to denitrify then. So then the next configuration for total nitrogen removal is the 4-stage Bardenpho. It's really taking that MLE and adding some additional steps onto it to acknowledge some of the shortcomings. So the idea here is we've got our anoxic zone with the recycle back to it from the tail end of the aerobic zone, but then we place a second anoxic zone after that to try and get another crack at any nitrates that have passed through that recycle. And in some instances, if a plant has a really low total nitrogen limit, or if depending on their influent carbon COD ratios, you can sometimes see a methanol feed or some type of supplemental carbon addition to this anoxic zone to drive that denitrification. And then the final step after that is to add another aerobic zone, bring the DO back up before you get into your clarifiers, so you don't have any issues with low DO in your clarifiers or effluent. So moving on to the biological phosphorus removal. This differs from the total nitrogen in the fact that we really don't off-gas anything here. 100% of the phosphorus that we remove has to go out with our waste sludge, and and then we have to keep it out and be careful not to return it with side streams. So in a typical activated sludge plant, your dry solids of your waste activated sludge are going to contain, around 1 to 2% total phosphorus in them already. To get enhanced biological phosphorus removal, we encourage the growth of some special microorganisms that actually accumulate excess phosphorus, and they allow us to get that percent phosphorus up, somewhere in the range of 2 to 5%, or even higher if you've got enough, if you've got the right chemistry coming into your plant. So what happens in this system is we use an anaerobic reactor to create a zone that encourages the growth of these microorganisms, because they have a competitive advantage. Whenever there's a lack of oxygen and a lack of nitrate, they can still suffice by releasing stored phosphorus as an energy source. And then later, once they get into aerobic conditions out of that stressful environment, they'll then uptake more phosphorus than they released and store it, in anticipation of having more that stressful environment again. And that's what drives up the content of the sludge. So here's a simplified illustration of a enhanced biological phosphorus removal process. You'll see the term EBPR, the acronym, a lot, referring to biological phosphorus removal. I have to say, engineers are good at coming up at confusing acronyms that nobody likes, but if you see that, that's what it is. This is commonly referred to as the AO process, and what it stands for is anaerobic anoxic, referring to the anaerobic zone at the head and oxic aerated tank at the end. And like I said, the anaerobic zone creates a chance for these phosphorus accumulating organisms to start having a competitive advantage. They'll release their phosphorus, and then in their aerobic zone, they take it back up, and then we can settle them in the clarifiers and waste them in the activated sludge. I guess I should also note, not only does the anaerobic zone provide opportunity for these microorganisms to thrive, it also, we can size it such that it provides an opportunity for us to actually create more volatile fatty acids. And that leads into the next slide here. The quantity of available volatile fatty acids is everything. The more we have, the more competitive advantage we have for the phosphorus accumulating organisms, and the more luxury uptake of phosphorus we can create. Unfortunately, our VFAs are the most biodegradable portion of the influence COD, and we need to protect them. So in a simplified AO configuration, what can happen if it's a plant that's nitrifying, you can actually be bringing nitrates back in your return activated sludge, and your anaerobic tank at that point can become anoxic, and the bacteria in there are actually going to start using the nitrates and your VFAs up before the phosphorus accumulating organisms can use them. So it's very important to protect the integrity of this anaerobic tank. And it's important to recognize that not all plants are going to have sufficient volatile fatty acids in their influent to meet a permit limit by biological means, or at least solely by biological means. So when we're designing these facilities and making decisions on how to meet these permit limits, we need to look very carefully at your influence substrate. And this is actually a table I borrowed from the WEF manual of practice on nutrient removal. So as you can see, we can try and guess at the ratios of carbon to phosphorus using some of our conventional means of measurement. So, just based on historical CBOD data, we can say, if you've got more than 25 to milligrams per liter compared to the 1 milligram per liter of phosphorus, you're probably going to be in pretty good shape. But as we go down this chart, the thing to consider is the top of the chart got the most amount of variability in it, and as you progress down, it's more of a certainty. So, if you want something a little bit more accurate, you could start doing soluble BOD testing and looking at your ratios there. I personally like to do a combination of COD testing, and you see this middle line, and then the readily biodegradable COD. And the reason is this readily biodegradable COD is really the best indicator on what you can do, because it represents not only the volatile fatty acids, but it also gets the soluble fraction of COD that's very easily going to be converted to volatile fatty acids within your anaerobic basin. Testing for the fatty acids themselves, there's multiple fatty acids. So to do that, you're going to end up doing quite a few tests per sample. On the flip side, with the readily biodegradable COD, it's not a conventional test. If you go to a lab and tell them you want to do this, there's not a published EPA method on it, but there are, published ways of doing this. So off to the side here, I've got this report written by the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources that gives some very good discussions on sampling for influent fractions and characterizing your wastewater. And it includes a detailed description on how to do a readily biodegradable COD test. And what you basically do is you take a sample of your influent, and you do a filter flocculated COD test on it to find the truly soluble fraction of the COD. You then also do that on your effluent, because a fraction of the soluble COD is unbiodegradable, and comparing the two of those can tell you what fraction of that influent soluble COD is not going to be biodegradable, and then the remainders you're readily biodegradable. At the same time, I like to pair that with COD testing. So you can then say, you know, on a typical day, here's what fraction of my total COD is readily biodegradable. And then COD testing on your influent, you know, for a longer term is much easier. It's just a single sample. So you can, once you have those ratios established, then look over a longer data set and kind of see, all right, here's how my readily biodegradable COD would look over a long term. Some ways we can manage the volatile fatty acids. As we're designing a plant, you know, we'll take into consideration your substrate ratios to help us size the anaerobic basin. You know, we can increase the size of that tank, the solid retention time in that basin to encourage more fermentation if we think it would be beneficial. In some cases, you know, if we have primary clarifiers, for example, at a plant, we can actually design a separate fermentation tank to ferment some of the COD in that primary sludge and return it to your anaerobic tank as readily biodegradable COD. There are some operational methods to help you create some volatile fatty acids for an existing facility. You know, there's some things you can do, tweaking primary clarifiers and flow routing, or even maybe trying to consider encourage some settling in some different tanks to where you can get some fermentation. And then obviously the prevention of oxygen and nitrates from entering the anaerobic zones, critical. We'll want to design facilities to avoid any areas that would entrain oxygen ahead of your activated sludge. So, you know, some culprits that to look out for would be like screw pumps, or if you had excess falls over weirs, or just really high zones of turbulence in channels or something that can entrain oxygen. Aerated grit chambers could be another one. And nitrates may not always be coming from internal to your plant too. You know, if your facilities, if you're feeding nitrates out in your collection system to address corrosion or odor issues, keep in mind that that will actually limit some of the volatile fatty acids coming into your plant. So some changes in your collection system can also impact the what you're seeing at the plant. I quickly wanted to go through some of these common phosphorus removal processes, and this one may look familiar. It is the A squared O, so it's kind of combining that AO that I mentioned first and the MLE. So the idea here is you want to add some total nitrogen removal so that you're not bringing those nitrates back in the return activated sludge. So we have our upfront anaerobic reactor followed by basically an MLE plant. And then our sludge that contains the excess phosphorus is wasted from the system. The one thing about this, as I mentioned earlier, the MLE is limited on how low it can get its total effluent nitrogen. So you do have some nitrates always getting back to your secondary clarifiers, and they will be coming into that anaerobic reactor, which would limit how far you can drive your phosphorus removal with this process. So somebody then modified that and came up with, well, first they came up with the University of Cape Town, and then that was quickly modified to the modified University of Cape Town. And the idea here is to actually split the anoxic zone into two separate reactors and to add a new recycle line. So the return activated sludge no longer comes into the anaerobic tank. Instead, we bring it into an anoxic basin where we utilize carbon from the influent wastewater to denitrify it. And then we use a recycle pipe back to the anaerobic basin to return our denitrified solids to the anaerobic zone. And the idea is that we just, you know, try and prevent any nitrates from getting in that zone. And then what follows is basically what we had before with the MLE, a second anoxic basin that's denitrifying a recycle from the aerobic tank. The one thing to really consider on this process, however, is this recycle line between the anoxic basin and the anaerobic tank really does dilute your mixed liquor concentration in the anaerobic tank. So it does make it more complicated to monitor your food to mass ratio, your sludge age, and that flow rate on that recycle needs to be carefully controlled. It does really impact, if it gets out of whack, it can really impact your ability to fermentate in the anaerobic basin. And then the next process that I'm sure you've all heard of is the 5-stage Bardenpho. It's basically taking the 4-stage Bardenpho and adding an anaerobic tank. The one thing about this is, again, by the time you finally get to that second anoxic basin, there may not be ample carbon left for denitrification. And so if you're trying to do biological phosphorus removal, that may drive the need to either make that a swing zone where you have the ability to add oxygen sometimes, or the ability to add nitrates such that you don't unintentionally get a anaerobic conditions and a phosphorus release here near the tail end of your plant. So I wanted to cover some other emerging processes here. This first one's a granular activated sludge, and I've got a graphic here that's I've taken from Aqua Aerobic's website. There's a couple manufacturers now that are selling proprietary processes where they can encourage the growth of these granular sludges. And there's the advantages of them are they tend to be much heavier than a typical flock, and they settle really fast. So you get a really good settling sludge, a good effluent with low and suspended solids. But then what they've also found with them is because it's such a dense granular, you actually get different zones within the flock itself. So the outer portion of the flock, would act as your typical aerobic zone. But then as you get into the middle, you start to see some denitrification occurring, where those microbes in the middle of the flock are denitrifying the nitrates. And then finally in the middle, you actually see anaerobic conditions where we do get some phosphorus removal through this one type of sludge without having all the different zones within the basin. Another emerging process that I really believe will really change some of the processes I went over earlier is something that is being referred to right now as S2 EBPR, because as I mentioned, engineers love their acronyms. And so they took EBPR, acknowledged that this is a second method of it. And the S, I believe, stands for side stream, because we're trying to do some side stream hydrolysis of either the recurrent activated sludge or your mixed liquor. And what they found is if you have this reactor that's fermenting a portion of your return activated sludge, say like 10 to 15% of your return activated sludge is in this unaerated tank that's holding it to ferment it, that stresses the microbes and encourages the growth of a newly discovered PAO that called Tetraspira, that's actually capable of using volatile fatty acids in a much more efficient manner than some of the more traditional PAOs. And so what they're finding is plants that do this can get very good phosphorus removal, even if their influence not really conducive to what you typically think would allow for enhanced phosphorus removal. The advantage of it is it can be implemented into existing configurations. Big disadvantage of it right now is it's still very much an emerging process. There's some rules of thumb where there's been research papers on plants that are doing this and the sizing of the basins, the amount of sludge they're fermenting. But there are not well-established growth kinetics for these microorganisms yet. And we can't really do design calculations to show, what facilities would successfully do this. And we can't put it into any type of modeling software yet to demonstrate that a design would effectively meet a permit limit with this. So the takeaway from that is right now, when designing new plants, a lots of flexibility in the design of your anaerobic tank and your influent piping and RAS piping, I think can really be beneficial, where you can design a facility that can do this, but you can also design it to operate in a more typical conventional phosphorus removal process. So moving on, some more of the operational things, and I probably need to speed up so we still have time left for questions here at the end. But some things that I would encourage on operations, if possible, get some portable orthophosphate probes. Orthophosphate is the soluble portion of the phosphorus in your plant, and that's really what we can uptake biologically. And it's the portion that we can remove chemically if we're doing chemical removal. So taking grab samples across your facility and measuring this can really paint a picture on what's going on. If everything's working correctly, we should see a high jump in phosphorus in your anaerobic reactor as the microorganisms release their excess phosphorus. And then we should start to see that decrease as we progress through the plant, particularly when we get to the aerated zones with the higher DO. Orthophosphate's also a good measure, if you're wanting to take regular samples on your effluent without actually measuring for total phosphorus. This is a quick, easy test that you can do to paint a picture on where you're at with your effluent. And it is beneficial on monitoring your side streams to try and catch any slugs that we may be returning from the biosolids processing. And similar note, the phosphorus content of your waste sludge can also provide insight into how much luxury uptake you're getting. Again, remember, we're trying to shoot for that 2 to 5% range or even higher. And it is really important to keep an eye on the DO and nitrates in any of your recycle streams or your return activated sludge. We want to make sure these nitrates aren't getting back to our anaerobic zone unintentionally. Most facilities that we design for biological phosphorus removal, we do include provisions for chemical removal as well. They're necessary whenever you have hiccups in your influent or biology. So the one thing to consider on that, though, is feeding these, especially depending on where you're feeding them. Feeding the chemical can erase the competitive advantage for the PAOs. So really carefully tune any chemical polishing that you're doing, and be aware that it is possible to wash your plant out with those. And again, solids retention time, similar to any other operations, plays a critical role in how these perform. As far as optimizing BNR, if you need to increase your volatile fatty acids, look for ways to increase the solids retention time in your anaerobic zone to get more fermentation there. We actually had a client that decided they wanted to rather not use the internal recycle coming into their anaerobic zone, and they experimented with turning their return activated sludge rates way down and holding more sludge in their secondary clarifiers. And they did this slowly over time and monitored it and really found the sweet spot where they could see a decrease in their nitrates in their sludge, but avoid any excess, avoid any anaerobic conditions to produce a secondary release of phosphorus, and they prevented any floating sludge. So it's really just that fine tuning there. It's also possible to ferment within primary clarifiers, or even to divert sludge into the anaerobic reactor. And also consider any opportunities if you got the flexibility to do some side stream hydrolysis. This is a quick slide graphic I borrowed from YSI on ORP probes. Monitoring of ORP is very helpful in the anaerobic and anoxic basins. It can paint a picture. In the anaerobic basin, you want to see that you're getting a good low ORP where you can encourage fermentation. If you start seeing it creep up, then that's an indication that, we've got some nitrates coming back or some DO getting recycled back. On the anoxic basins, you want to try and stay in that denitrification range here between -100 and 100. If you start getting, trending towards the anaerobic side, it's possible you can get a secondary phosphorus release, and then obviously you're going to have that soluble phosphorus go out your effluent unintentional. I've touched on this a little bit. It is actually protecting the anaerobic zone, limit DO, monitor nitrates in your as and recycle flows, and keep an eye on that ORP. It's also, in designing plants, I like to put in wet weather modes of operation where we can divert excess wet weather around the anaerobic tank to protect the integrity of that zone. And then a quick note, we could do a whole presentation on this topic by itself, but keep an eye on the side streams. As we uptake all these nutrients, we're releasing them in a soluble form whenever we start doing volatile destruction within our sludge processing. And then whenever we go to dewater the sludge, that filtrate can contain quite a bit of these side streams coming back on you. So it's important to monitor the content of those in new designs. It's important to include provisions for equalization. This can prevent slugs from passing through your plant, and the equalization tanks also provide an opportunity to actually hit that side stream with chemical when it's in its most concentrated form, and you get your most efficient removal. So that I'd like to switch gears and allow our last 15 minutes here for any questions that we may have. All right, so it looks like I do have one question here about the portable orthophosphate probes. So I think I guess I should have been. It's not so much a probe as you've got some of the HOC portable analyzers where you can take the sample and put it in the vial in the analyzer and analyze it there on the spot. So yeah, it's more of a portable analyzer than a probe. And I could follow up with information on some of the exact models of that. But yeah, it is more of a portable analyzer than a probe. Another question. Any suggestions on preventing the re-release of phosphorus from a secondary clarifier? Yes, so on that, is very interesting. I mentioned the Springfield example where they were closely monitoring the nitrate in their return activated sludge. So, as long as you have those nitrates in your sludge still, it should technically be anoxic, and you shouldn't be seeing the secondary release. But if your sludge blankets are sitting long enough that you start dropping off on your nitrates, and keep in mind there is limits on how far it will denitrify. So I guess there will always be some nitrates present. But if you start seeing anaerobic conditions in the sludge, that's when the secondary release can occur. So yeah, the really key is keeping your return activated sludge rate at return activated sludge at a pumping rate to prevent overly large sludge blankets or prevent the sludge from sitting there long enough to go anaerobic. Fortunately, secondary clarifiers, the secondary release you see there can be less than what you'd see elsewhere in the plant, just because by that point you have so few remaining readily biodegradable. I mean, there shouldn't be hardly any readily biodegradable COD by that point. So there's not a lot for those organisms to work with. But yeah, just preventing that sludge from becoming anaerobic and keeping the sludge blankets to a minimum should help with that. And I think that's all the questions I'm seeing right now. If anyone else has any, please feel free to ask. We do have the remainder of our time. We were going to actually do the actual meeting for the operator group. So I will bring in, I will stop our recording and we'll start the meeting portion of our